shine light on other important questions, such as, what do the Old Testament commands have to do with New Testament Christians? Should Christians seek to obey the Old Testament just like the Israelites, or can we unhitch ourselves from it altogether? We can rule out one interpretation right away. Jesus is not abolishing the law and the prophets, and he says as much explicitly. But on the other hand, he apparently didn't come to simply keep, restate, or reestablish them either. The word he used signals something more radical and profound. He came to fulfill them. Now we may ask ourselves, is Jesus retiring the Old Testament commands and replacing them with his own expression of God's will? At first glance, Jesus may seem to be disagreeing with God's commands in the Old Testament, but Jesus warns us at the outset to avoid this impression. His approach to the Torah is complex and subtle. It should not be misunderstood as rejection. He does not take issue with the Torah itself, but with interpretations that obscure its meaning. He seeks to dispose of these misinterpretations of God's will. Here's one of the key questions we can ask of Jesus' statement. What specifically did he come to fulfill? We may at first assume he's only referring to ethical commands, but he actually refers to something much broader. He has in view the entire Old Testament, which he summarized here and elsewhere with the phrase, the law and the prophets. So these include the whole Old Testament with all of its commands and covenants and poems and prophecies. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill, Jesus announces. He intends to show us how to carry out God's commands in a way that fulfills their purpose. A major concern for Jewish followers of Jesus was the relationship of the Messiah's teaching to the Mosaic law. So this passage in Matthew chapter 5 demonstrates that the Messiah who fulfills the prophecy also fulfills the law. The law and the prophets comprise the Hebrew scriptures in which God's will is revealed to the people of Israel. Besides the general principles outlined in the Ten Commandments, the written Torah, or first 5 books of the Old Testament, contains much material on the application of laws to specific situations. To the people of Israel, obedience to the law was a primary demand from God, which we find referenced in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 1 through 8. And it was expressed through very concrete observances in daily life. Thus, after outlining some startling new values, Jesus is careful to show that his teaching is not contrary to the familiar Mosaic law, but a new interpretation, a perfection of the law as previously understood. The word fulfill carries the sense of completion, of accomplishing the purpose or goal that God intended for the law. Jesus makes it clear that the law is important and his followers are to take it very seriously. Verse 20 brings the new twist. Jesus' followers are to be even more righteous than the scribes and Pharisees, who were understood to be the experts in obeying the law. As Jesus illustrates in the next few passages of this gospel, obeying the law is not an end in itself. It is a means of developing the values and attitudes which he had summarized in the Beatitudes. One way of expressing the purpose of God's commands is righteousness, that is, being just and merciful in imitation of God, living in a way that fosters justice and peace amongst people. Individual divine commands show us how to progress toward this goal. Another way of stating the purpose of God's commands is to say that they instruct us in how best to serve our neighbor's welfare. Jesus declares that God's law is fulfilled when we treat others as we would like to be treated. God's law comes into focus when we view it through the lens of this golden rule. Thus, the way to properly interpret and apply God's commands is to ask questions such as, what does this teaching show me about how to foster what is right and just? And how does this instruction guide me in loving my neighbor? Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 48 is a series of illustrations of the Messiah's new approach to the law. They are often called the antitheses because each is introduced by the formula, "You have heard that it was said, but I say to you." In each case, Jesus calls for attitudes that go beyond obeying the letter of the law. To fulfill the law, we need to look at more than outward behavior. We need to examine internal attitudes. Jesus gives us clear indications of his interpretation of the law, and he goes far beyond what was the accepted practice of the time. He gets to the root or underlying causes of the problems. First, he quotes or paraphrases scripture. Second, he cites an erroneous interpretation drawn from an oral tradition or application within the scripture itself that is open to misunderstanding. He then presents his own interpretation, bringing to light the fundamental intention of the scriptural command. You have heard that it was said to your ancestors, "You shall not kill, and whoever kills will be liable to judgment. But I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment." Jesus' interpretation of this law identifies the underlying cause of murder. That's anger. He points out that the way to control anger is through reconciliation. He seems to say, put first things first. Relationships are more important than legal formalities. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery," but I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. This passage deals with the injunction against adultery. Again, Jesus distinguishes between the act and the inward disposition that causes it. Avoiding sexual involvement with another person's spouse is the rule, but Jesus advises control of lustful feelings, thereby getting to the root of the problem. It was also said, "Whoever divorces his wife must give her a bill of divorce. But I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, unless the marriage is unlawful, causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Jesus' comments on divorce further reveal his concern for the significance of human relationships. He seems to be saying that marriage is too important to be treated as lightly as the law has come to treat it, allowing divorce for little or no reason. Again, you have heard it said to your ancestors, "Do not take a false oath, but make good to the Lord all that you vow." But I say to you, do not swear at all. The law that forbids swearing false oaths is not faulty, but Jesus logically asserts that swearing of any kind is unnecessary if we practice telling the truth all the time. The word swear used here in the legal sense means to guarantee the truth of one's words. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, offer no resistance to one who is evil. When someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other one to him as well. In these verses, Jesus calls us to stretch beyond the old or childish concept of even retaliation for wrongs. The law from Leviticus chapter 24, verses 18 through 20, is an attempt to prevent escalation of violence and stated that a person could retaliate only as much as the wrong done to him and no more. If someone breaks your arm, you can't go and break both arms, both legs, and knock out his eyes. You cannot do more than what was done to you. But Jesus says, forget violence altogether and respond with generosity. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. This last section offers the basis for Jesus' new ethic, and that is God's love for all people. The messianic message based on love emphasizes our need to pattern our attitudes after God's attitudes if we are to be God's children. Jesus extends the old law of love for brother and neighbor to include the people not only in one's own community, but also outsiders, building on the theme of Christ's universal mission. The series of antitheses concludes with a call to wholehearted commitment to imitate our loving God. Before moving on, let's just take a quick look at chapter 5, verse 22. But I say to you, well, who is this man who speaks with such authority about God's will for human beings? He claims to know God's will so well that he can confidently identify the original purpose of God's commands and can speak with assurance about the ultimate consequences of failing to achieve God's purpose. One scholar comments that while Jesus interprets God's law as it was revealed in the Old Testament, he does so not as its servant, but as its Lord, end quote. Jesus' interpretations of the law are even more relevant today than when he first spoke those words. He is reminding us that although we live in this world, we are citizens of a higher kingdom, and as such, we are held to higher standards. God bless you.